Our first speaker is Professor Zhou, who grew up in Yangzhou in Jiangsu in China. After gaining a bachelor's degree from Nanjing Agricultural University, he worked at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences in Beijing. He obtained a Master of Economics degree from the University of New England in Armidale in Australia, and his PhD study was carried out at Griffith University. He is presently working at the School of Business at James Cook University. He is also the Director of the Centre for Austrasia Business Studies at JCU. Previously, he's taught at the University of Sydney and was Director of the Asian Agribusiness Research Centre at that university. His research interests include food consumption and production, grain economics, comparative economics, agricultural and rural development policy, agricultural prices and marketing, and international agricultural trade issues. His work in recent years has focused on food consumption and production, agricultural commodity markets, agricultural development, international trade issue, and the agribusiness development in China, India, Korea, and Australia. So Professor Zhou is uniquely qualified to talk about the changing nature of China's demand for agricultural imports, and I'm sure all present look forward to his address with great interest.
Thanks, Mick, for the opportunity to talk here. The presentation by David this morning was very informative and entertaining. If you expect my presentation is as entertaining as David's or more entertaining than his, then your expectation is too high. Because English is not my first language, and I don't know how to use a lot of Australian slangs. And the only thing I have been trying very hard to practice is something I say to my neighbor, Jock McDonald. "Good day, mate. How are you, you old bastard?" But he accepts that. For the same reason, if what I'm going to say in my presentation is contrary to what the minister has said, then purely that's because of my English comprehension issue. So it's not sort of intentionally to be contrary to what he has said. Mick asked me to talk at the session that is about whether China and Asia will be the future for Australian agriculture. I thought that's a great question to ask and an important question to answer. What I will do in the presentation is to provide some insights about the Chinese consumers' consumption changes, because whether our agricultural future is in China or broad Asia, that depends on whether the consumers in the region will demand the kind of foods we produce. And particularly, Mick asked me to focus on those middle-income class consumers, see what they are demanding is what we are producing. Mick didn't ask me to talk about the overall Asia, so I might provide a little bit thought on that. So after a brief introduction, I will talk about food consumption by income group in China. That will help us to see the higher income groups, what they are actually demanding. And then I will talk a little bit about China's food imports to give us some ideas to see whether China will import and import what in about another 8 years by 2020. And finally, I will offer some concluding comments. China's consumption of foods of higher values has been increasing, and the overall patterns of food consumption are changing. We have identified a number of drivers behind such changes, and I'm not going to go through into each of these drivers in detail. The presentation today is based on a study we did for DEF, and the full report for DEF now is available on DEF's website, And if you are interested, if you don't know how to find it, send me an email. I'll be more than happy to forward you the link. So the changes in food consumption patterns, we expect that will continue and China's overall demand for food and for food of higher quality, higher value will continue to rise. And in fact, that the whole Asia's demand for food will also rise. And therefore, we are asking some questions. As I've said, that I will only provide some insights into about the kind of foods Chinese middle class consumers would demand. As I indicated in the earlier slide, income actually is the most important factor that has driven the consumption patterns to change in China. And as a result of that, consumers' demand for foods of plant origin has started to decline a while ago, but the demand for food of higher value has been on the increase. First, I provide you with a few slides about the overall national food consumption trends. As we can see from this diagram, the per capita consumption of food grains has been declining in both rural areas and urban areas. But on the other hand, the consumption of foods of animal origin has been on the increase. In this diagram, we have meats and poultry meats. Meats include pork, beef, and mutton, and we see the increasing trend. And this diagram shows about the consumption of poultry eggs, aquatic products, and dairy products. And again, we see the increasing trends. However, there are large consumption gaps between low-income and high-income residents in both rural and urban areas. First, I'll just show you the income difference between consumers. If we divide consumers into 5 groups, we call it quintiles, and then you see that for urban consumers, the richest income is much higher than the lowest income group. And similarly, in rural areas, it's also much higher than the lowest income. But certainly, there is a huge difference between rich urban and rich rural people. And this is the data for 2010. But unfortunately, over the past 3 decades, the income gap between the rural and urban people, although slightly closed a little bit in the early 1980s, but still, but has been enlarging, and this trend will continue. And unfortunately, the government still hasn't done much to narrow the gap, which is not good news for anyone. But anyway, that's not the most important point here. Now, in terms of the consumption of different kinds of foods by different income group consumers, I'll probably spend a little bit of time on this slide, and then later on will be easy for us to see. Now, that's the consumption by rural consumers and lowest income and highest income. Generally, you see that when consumers' income is higher, the consumption of, in this particular case, pork is higher. And over years, we didn't see much increase. And so from this diagram, you see that when income increases, the consumption increases. And that's the consumption changes over time. That's about pork. In urban areas, you will see similar, we can explain this in similar way. So lower income people and highest income people. Now, you will see that why over time that the consumption didn't increase much. Well, one assumption is that probably when Chinese people become a little bit more richer, they might like to diverse to consume other meats, such as beef, mutton, or aquatic products. But there is another point we need to pay attention. That is, what data we are available here to show in these diagrams are the government published data. That doesn't include away from home consumption, which is difficult to get for the whole as a sort of a good sample for the whole nation. So we just used the government data as a surrogate to show the trends. Generally speaking, when people become richer, they will consume outside home more frequently. Therefore, the idea is that the more the higher the income, and the more likely chance they will consume away from home. Therefore, you would probably imagine there will be some increase here. Or alternatively, that means that they moved away from pork. Now, in terms of beef and mutton, we don't see sort of a dramatic increase over the years, but we do see that when income increases, consumers will consume more. Again, we can't use this to say that Chinese consumers are not eating more beef or mutton because of the away from home consumption. As some of you might have visited China, and in the Chinese restaurants, and the consumption of beef and mutton has been pretty popular in the past 2 decades. If we look a little bit closer about the consumption in urban areas only, we see some increase in beef consumption, and but for mutton, it's a bit flat. We don't have the same data for rural areas, so just for urban areas, but we see some trends here. Now, for poultry meats, we see the trends, the increase in the consumption for consumption at home. And next is about poultry eggs. It's interesting to note about this slight declining. Maybe people are a little bit conscious about health impact, because sometimes Chinese people could be misled by the media, say consuming eggs are not good, cholesterol is too high. But need to think a little bit more about that. Now, in terms of per capita consumption of dairy products by income group, and clearly that for higher income people, they consume significantly more than lower income consumers, and similar trends in rural areas, but for rural areas, much lower than urban consumers. For dairy product consumption by more specific product groups in urban areas, milk powder, and yogurt. And over the past 10 years, yogurt consumption has increased a fair bit by all income groups. And there is a belief that it's difficult for you to produce yogurt if your milk is not of good quality. But some people say that's actually not true. But anyway, that's the reason that they reduced their consumption of milk because of the melamine threat. Aquatic products, and we see the dramatic difference between rich and the poor in both rural and urban areas. And the alcoholic drinks in urban areas only. That's for Chinese liquor. It's pretty strong. Some people call it rocket fuel, if you have tried it. And that's beer, and that's wine. And if we enlarge this bit, actually it's increasing very nicely for wine. But this is a bit puzzling, isn't it? But actually, China's beer production has been increasing dramatically. Export has been minimal. So you must think that a lot of beer has been consumed away from home, because this only includes the consumption at home. So here actually give us some sort of good news that the wine consumption in China in the future is likely to increase, and the potential will be enormous. And we've already seen our increased export to China. In terms of this bit, probably it's again affected by the away from home consumption. Some people still like Chinese liquor, although overall the consumption is declining. For fruits we see the huge difference again. So clearly that for those more wealthy people, let's say that those people in the top group, they are the richest in the country, but if related to Australia, if we call them middle income consumers, and they obviously demand a lot of products that are of higher value. So the per capita consumption of foods of higher value by high-income residents is higher, and particularly for beef, mutton, poultry, eggs, dairy products, aquatic products, and fruits. And the gap between the rich and the poor is obvious, but also for rural residents, their consumption is much lower than urban counterparts, at least 30 years behind. So all this points out that the food consumption increase in China can be enormous if the poor people's income increases and if the rural people's income increases. So as a result, many of us are interested in what's going to happen in the future. And for our purpose in this particular room, we are interested in tapping into the Chinese market. So for that reason, we want to have some ideas about the future. Well, projecting the future demand and supply of China's food is not easy. It's not easy for anyone. And this just a few examples to show you that that's the projection of soybean production, consumption, and net imports by 3 different sources. And you see the huge difference for year 2020. And because of this reason, we thought that if we carry out another sophisticated econometric analysis, it's unlikely that we will deliver something that might be dramatically accurate. But so as a result, we didn't use any sophisticated methods. We just used our own judgments by with our own sort of a gut feeling and our knowledge of the consumption situation in China. But by doing so, we also sort of combine some other leading projections available. So just to show one briefly, show one a little bit in more detail. This shows the actual of the production, consumption, and net imports of a particular product in 2010. And these are the available projections available at the moment for 2020. And that's the most important bit for you to pay attention. That's our own judgment. And not much further details will be given here because of the time limit. So if we know the pattern, then the rest we should be pretty easy to follow. So in terms of wheat, we thought that probably by 2020, around 2 million tons of wheat will be imported. Rice, largely self-sufficient. Maize will be a bit higher, and also in terms of the actual amount can also be uncertain because of the possibility of having more animals raised domestically. But at the moment, we think that's about 5 million tons. And for barley, will be about, probably stable around 2 million tons. Soybean will be a little bit high, 70 million tons. Sugar, 3 million tons. Pork, about 1 million tons. Beef, 500,000. Don't get too disheartened. We can find other ways to earn money from the Chinese market. Mutton, 0.3 million tons. Poultry, 500,000. Can be a bit uncertain. Dairy products will be higher, about 2 million tons in terms of milk powder or sort of dry materials, not the milk. And for a few other products, vegetable oil seeds will be in a net import position around 2 million tons, and vegetables will be net export, probably 10 million tons or so, and fruits, net exports. Aquatic products will be net import, and eggs will be largely self-sufficient in China. that's the projections for 2020. Probably might be useful to have a quick look at what happened in China's net imports of several major products over the past 2 decades, particularly after China joined WTO in 2001. And as the minister has already pointed out, after China joined the WTO, in general, the imports have increased, and China has turned out from a net exporter to be a net importer in agricultural products. But the imports quantity varies over time. It's not consistent. And you see that here, dairy products suddenly increased a fair bit, and that's largely associated with the melamine scandal. And nowadays, not many Chinese people trust the Chinese dairy products, and that caused a lot of damage to the domestic industry. But then pork imports increased a bit, and for beef and mutton, pretty stable and not large quantity, and for poultry, it's changes quite dramatically. For crop products and for soybean, dramatic increase. For all others, relatively smaller quantity. However, because of the high imports of sugar, in this diagram you see that they got too clustered. So I'll enlarge it so that we can see a little bit easier. Clearly that we can see that wheat import is on the increase, and over 1 million tons last year, and this year increased. And for rice, used to export, but now imported a little bit. For barley, fairly stable. We expect it will be sort of around 2 million over the years till 2020. And for maize, used to be a net exporter in a large quantity, but now started to import. So that's the latest. Compare the first 7 months this year to the same time period last year, we see the increase in imports in pork. The others probably might be sort of, by the end of the year, will be similar to last year's. For the other crop products, we see the increased net imports in wheat, rice, and corn. And that's for the, again, for the first 7 months this year compared to the same period last year. So clearly that you see the increased imports here. Now, because of this scale, so this got a bit sort of a bit buried, so just to enlarge that, you see the larger increase. Now, the reason I'm trying to show you here is that just try to update you with what has happened in China. But the message here is that probably we cannot use this as a gauge to see what's going to happen in the near future, because there are particular reasons for this to take place. For example, corn imports increased a fair bit. We're not sure whether they actually needed that much, and whether some traders might have imported more for hoarding purposes, for speculation. For rice, there are some reasons. They imported more from Vietnam and Pakistan. Part of the reason is that China exports a lot of manufactured products to these two countries, but these two countries don't have many to sell to China, so they import rice. But the Vietnam rice is not selling very well in China. And for wheat import increase, and partly because recently, because of the high price of corn, and Chinese people used more wheat to feed animals, and that's part of the reason. And this is unlikely to continue for too long. Anyway, so that gives us some ideas about the import needs for China into 2020. So in overall, China's net imports of foods are unlikely very large by 2020. However, still 8 years to go. Whether China's net imports will be bigger than this or smaller than this will be critically affected by agricultural subsidies in China. But nonetheless, in the longer term, we believe that China's food imports will be increased. There is no other choice because China's resources won't be able to satisfy the increasing demand. And finally, I'll just offer my comments about whether China and Asia are the future for Australian agriculture. For China, well, maybe, but too much uncertainty. As a country, personally, I believe that Australia shouldn't strategically place China as Australia's agricultural future for three reasons. One is that currently the Chinese political and social environment is not very stable. You don't know what's going to happen in a few years' time. That will obviously affect trade. The second reason is that sometimes China's imports may be not purely due to economic considerations, but political considerations. For example, if China believes that some countries import too many goods from China, and China couldn't sort of handle the trade surplus, and then China may choose to buy some goods from those countries to mitigate the trade surplus. And the other reason is that although we are very efficient and we produce very well, but as a country overall, the total quantity of our agricultural products is tiny. And we don't need to rely on any country, particularly China, as our future because of the uncertainties. And also, countries like China and India, probably one day Indonesia, their demand for a particular product, if they really need, is enormous. We're not in a position to supply anyway, because if they need a lot, we're not in a position to supply to them on sort of a reliable basis because of some weather patterns or some other sort of conditions that affect our production here. So that's my personal view. And well, is Asia the future for Australian agriculture? The answer definitely is yes. And I'm not going to explain here because Mick didn't ask me to do so. However, if you are interested, you can see the paper I've written earlier. In that paper, I think I pointed out very clearly that Asia will offer a lot of opportunities for Australia's agricultural industries. Thank you.